I didn't expect the sound of my own voice to echo the way it did, sharp enough to make the air between us feel thinner. The dining room light flickered against the wine bottle, and Edward was standing there with that calm, maddening steadiness he always had. He'd just folded his napkin, slow and precise, like he was putting away the last piece of a day he'd already decided was over. I watched the way his hand hovered at the stem of his glass, how he didn't look at me right away, just let the silence settle before lifting his eyes. And I still said it, if I could undo one thing from my youth, it'd be you. I don't know if I wanted a fight or a reaction or some crack in his perfect quiet, but instead, he just set the corkscrew down with a soft, final sound that felt louder than yelling. Before I go on, if you're listening to this, take a second to hit subscribe and tap like. It helps the team keep these stories coming, and 97% of people forget to do it. He stood up the moment after I finished the sentence, almost as if he'd been waiting for me to give him a reason. No sigh, no anger. His chair didn't scrape. He pushed it back gently, the way he always opened and closed things, never forcing anything, never raising his voice. That control used to comfort me. In that moment, it terrified me. The way he looked at me wasn't cold, not even detached. It was something worse. Acceptance. He accepted what I'd said, as if I had just handed him a fact, not a wound. "Well," he said, his voice low and smooth, "let me make that easy." There was no theatrical pause, no slamming doors, no dramatic storming off, just the deliberate, quiet way he moved, like he'd already thought this through long before dinner. He didn't take his plate or his jacket from the chair, or even glance at the framed picture on the wall of us standing on the shoreline 2 summers ago. He simply walked past me, his steps steady, almost peaceful. I could hear the faint rustle of fabric as he grabbed his keys from the hook, and I didn't say a single word to stop him. I should have. Even now, replaying that moment, I feel the tightening in my chest, the way the air seemed to hold its breath as he passed my shoulder. I could have apologized. I could have said his name. I could have reached out before he crossed the threshold. But I stayed still, like I was pinned to the chair by my own pride. My heartbeat was loud enough to echo in my ears, but I didn't open my mouth. When the door closed behind him, it wasn't a slam. It was a hush, a soft click that felt like someone sealing an envelope with something important inside, something final. I sat there staring at the empty space he'd left, the corkscrew still lying where he'd placed it, its metal glinting under the overhead light. The wine in my glass barely rippled, but everything inside me did. It didn't occur to me then that he might not come back. Edward always came back. He was predictable, reliable, stable to a fault. The kind of man who checked weather patterns before weekend plans and labeled the leftovers in the fridge. I thought he'd walk around the block, breathe, maybe call a friend, maybe sleep on the couch. I assumed morning would arrive with awkward apologies, maybe a tense silence, maybe a conversation we should have had years ago. But the moment the echo of that closing door faded, something in the house shifted. The air felt too still. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. It was a vacuum where his presence used to sit, warm and solid. I didn't know it yet, but that was the last time I'd see him standing in that doorway. The last time he'd fold a napkin at our table. The last time he'd refill my glass with that quiet care I'd stopped appreciating long before I realized I'd miss it. I stayed seated long after he left, staring into the dark hallway, waiting for footsteps that never came. The night wrapped itself around me, thick and unmoving, and I didn't even realize I wasn't breathing until much later, when the quiet started to feel like the beginning of something I couldn't name, something sharp enough to cut, but soft enough to hide its edge. I didn't know that with one sentence I hadn't just hurt him, I had erased him. The sound of the morning was wrong. It wasn't that anything was missing, it was that everything felt too untouched. The coffee pot hadn't been used, the shower was dry, his shoes weren't by the door where they always were, lined up with military precision, second from the left. My first thought, absurdly, was that maybe he'd just gone for a ride, but even that was strange. Edward didn't do impulse, Edward planned his spontaneity. I walked to the closet barefoot, the floor colder than usual, and opened the door without thinking. His half was empty. Not messy, not ransacked, empty. No hangers, no folded stacks of t-shirts, no faint cologne on the wool coat I used to tease him for wearing when it dropped below 60. Just space. It didn't feel like he'd left. It felt like he'd never been there to begin with. The panic didn't hit right away. I think part of me was still trying to solve it, like it was a puzzle he'd left for me to piece together. I walked through the house, opening doors like maybe he was behind one of them, arms crossed, waiting to talk. But the garage gave me my answer. The Harley, his pride, his escape, the only thing he ever polished more than his work shoes, was gone. I opened the safe, hoping to find his passport, the documents, the emergency cash envelope. Gone. Even the old leather pouch he kept his grandfather's dog tags in was missing. The kitchen was too quiet. Even the fridge hum felt louder than it should. That's when I saw it. Folded cleanly on the granite counter next to the fruit bowl I hadn't filled in weeks. A single note. Fixed your mistake. Have a good life. Nothing else. No signature. No indication of where he went. Just that line like a scalpel. Precise, clean, surgical. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. I thought maybe if I turned it over there'd be more. I don't know why I thought that. He said everything he needed to in 8 words. I called his phone, straight to voicemail. I called again, and again. It didn't even ring. By noon, it was disconnected. No message, no forwarding number. Like the line itself had never existed. I tried texting. Come home. Let's talk. Please. Nothing sent. Each one bounced back with a hollow thud of rejection. I tried his email. Same thing. Undeliverable. The address no longer exists. I sat at the kitchen table with the note in one hand and my phone in the other, the silence pressing in from all sides. Every time I thought I understood what was happening, the reality shifted under my feet. This wasn't a dramatic exit. This wasn't a cry for attention. This was a deletion. A man who had made himself vanish with the same precision he folded his napkin with. I didn't cry, not that day. My eyes burned, but the tears wouldn't come. I was too shocked, too proud, too rattled by the idea that I hadn't even seen it coming, that in one night, with one sentence, I had broken something so completely that it no longer existed in the morning, not in this house, not in this city, not in any inbox or voicemail. He was just gone. The worst part wasn't the silence, it was the efficiency, no mess, no argument, no goodbye, just subtraction. He had always been the kind of man who fixed things, quietly, without fanfare, leaky faucets, stuck drawers, flat tires, fading love, and now, apparently, himself. He was gone before I even woke up. He didn't leave a trail, not a digital one, not an emotional one, not even the kind that lingers on old receipts or voicemail greetings. By the time I started looking, Edward had already started erasing himself. It was only later, when I pieced together the details, that I learned how deliberately he had done it. 6 hours south, on a stretch of coast where the tide came in like a hush and left like a secret, he stepped off a Greyhound with nothing but a duffel bag and a jacket he'd owned since before we met. No reservations, no name given. He walked past the bus stop and kept going until he reached the edge of the town, where the roads narrowed and the trees bent low like they were hiding him from the world. He found a small cottage just off the water, peeling white paint, a rusted mailbox, and a porch that creaked under its own history. The owner was a man who didn't ask questions, only counted cash, and handed over a set of keys. Edward handed him 5 weeks' rent in an envelope. No contract, no forwarding address, no ID required, just a handshake. The cottage didn't have Wi-Fi. That wasn't an oversight. It was a requirement. He turned off his phone, stripped out the SIM, and tossed it into the ocean on his second morning there. He didn't open a new account, didn't register for utilities in his own name. At the diner down the road, he paid in cash and never asked for a receipt. When they asked his name, he simply said, North. Not a lie, not entirely, just a direction. He started showing up at the docks, offering help with boats. Quiet help, the kind people remember, but don't talk about much. He rewired engines, replaced rotted planks, coated rusted bolts with oil and patience. Word spread the way it always does in towns like that, not loud, but fast. Mr. North, they called him. Nobody asked where he came from. Everyone just nodded when he showed up. He slept without alarms, woke with the sun, no news, no feeds, no calendar alerts, just the slow ritual of rebuilding a life without noise. No ring, no watch, not even a photo to prove he'd ever had someone waiting on the other end of a dinner table. He cooked simple meals, drank black coffee, read paperbacks from the local library one at a time, always returning them early. He kept the curtains open and the door locked. Each morning he'd sit on the weathered bench by the beach, boots buried in the sand, staring at the tide. He didn't journal, didn't talk to himself. He just watched. Let the water roll in and out, again and again, like the undoing of memory, like it could scrub her name out of his thoughts if he waited long enough. Some nights he'd walk along the pier after dark, hands in his pockets, the wind knotting his hair. He wouldn't go far, just to the edge where the wooden beams started to groan under each step. He'd stop there, stand still, let the salt air sting his eyes until it wasn't clear what was grief and what was just the sea. He didn't try to replace what he'd lost. That would have implied it had value he still wanted. Instead, he made himself small, tucked his past into the folds of that quiet life and let it rot gently in the shadows. The pain didn't vanish, but it dulled, became manageable, routine. He never said her name aloud, not once. He didn't have to. The ocean took it from him every night, and every morning it brought him back a little more peace in return. The mistake didn't hit me all at once. It came slowly, like fog rolling in under the doorframe, quiet, insistent, impossible to ignore. At first, I told myself he just needed space, that maybe I'd gone too far at dinner, said something sharp I didn't really mean, that he'd come home eventually with that same quiet steadiness, eyes a little tired, mouth thin, but ready to move on like we always did. But days passed, then a week, then a second. When I finally picked up my phone to call him, I half expected to hear his voice, calm and clipped, saying, "Sophie," but all I got was that sterile robotic tone. "This number is no longer in service." I hung up. Called again. Same result. I refreshed my email. Nothing. I checked his calendar, our shared reminders, old threads. Everything still there, frozen in time like the moment before car crash. I stared at his last message to me. "I'll pick up wine on the way home." 3 hours before that dinner. Before I opened my mouth and threw a grenade. I logged into our joint bank account. My stomach dropped. It had already been separated, not closed, divided, methodically, precisely. Even the brokerage account had been rerouted. I hadn't even seen the withdrawal notifications. He'd done it fast and quiet, like a man packing a parachute mid-fall. I drove to his office, parked 2 blocks away like a coward, waited outside until I saw someone I recognized, Jacob, one of the younger engineers he'd mentored. I approached him casually, trying not to let my panic spill through. "Is Edward in today?" He blinked. He resigned, gave notice 2 weeks ago. That was it. No one knew more. No one had heard from him since. He didn't say goodbye. No farewell emails. No LinkedIn update. Just, gone. I drove to Daniel's house, Edward's best friend since college, the kind of man who used to tease me about burning toast, but always brought a bottle of something decent to our anniversary dinners. His truck was in the driveway. The porch light was on, but when I knocked, no one answered. I knocked again. The silence behind the door was thicker than brick. So I leaned in, pressed my hand against the wood, and whispered, "Please, just tell him I'm sorry." I didn't expect a response, but a voice, Daniel's, came low, steady, and final from behind the door. He fixed it, let it be. Not cruel, not angry, just done. Like it had all been settled already, and my part in the story had been reduced to a single closed chapter. I stood there for a while, long enough for the porch light to shut off automatically. Long enough to feel the weight of something I couldn't unwind settling around me like a coat I never asked to wear. The echo of what I'd said at dinner wouldn't stop replaying in my head, not just the words, but the tone, the offhandedness. The cruelty dressed up as cleverness. I said it like a punchline. He took it like a verdict. And now, every path to him was sealed. Every voice I turned to had already gone quiet. I hadn't lost him. I'd erased him. And worse than that, he let me. 2 weeks later, after another dinner I didn't finish and another silence I couldn't climb out of, I found myself walking home with that sick, sloshing weight of too much wine and too little dignity. The streets were too loud, or maybe I was too quiet. I wasn't sure anymore. My heels scraped the pavement like they were dragging dead weight, and my breath fogged in the cold air as I muttered his name under it, Like a prayer I hadn't earned the right to say. The house looked the same, lights dimmed, his chair still in the corner, one of his flannels hanging off the back like a ghost still lived here, but he didn't. I knew that, my phone knew that, every unanswered call knew that. But drunk and aching and unwilling to let the silence win one more night, I sat down on the floor of the hallway because the couch felt too far and pulled up his old number. It was still saved under Ed like nothing had happened. My thumb hovered over the call button, heart pounding like I was about to confess something instead of just dial. I don't know what I expected. Voicemail, a disconnected tone, the dead air I'd been trained to hear, but it rang. For the first time in weeks, it rang. My breath caught. I pressed the phone to my ear, sitting up straighter as if he could see me. 2 rings, 3, I whispered, "Please." And then someone answered. But it wasn't Edward. It was a woman. Her voice was calm, collected, not annoyed, not curious, just steady. "He doesn't speak to you anymore," she said. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. "Don't call again." Click. Silence. I stared at the phone, screen still lit, call ended. I redialed immediately. Straight to voicemail this time. I called again. Dead. Like the line had closed forever after that one breath of life. I sat there, frozen, not because of the words, but because of the voice. I didn't recognize her, not one bit. It wasn't his sister, not his cousin, not a friend I'd met in our years together. It was someone new, someone close enough to answer, confident enough to speak for him, calm enough to know she was allowed to. And she didn't ask who I was, which meant she already knew. It hit me all at once and too slowly at the same time. He wasn't just gone, he was replaced, and not by a fantasy, not by solitude or regret or longing, by someone real, someone there, answering his phone, calling me by what I'd become, the past. I became obsessed, and there's no other word for it. It wasn't love anymore, not guilt, not even grief. It was something colder, more consuming, the kind of obsession that wakes you up at 3 a.m. with your fingers already reaching for your laptop. The screens glow your only companion while your heart races like it's chasing something just out of reach. I told myself I only wanted closure, that if I could just find out where he'd gone, I could make peace with it. Apologize, explain, something, anything, but the truth was simpler. I couldn't bear not knowing, not after all those years, not after everything we'd built and broken. People don't just disappear, not without leaving some trace. And Edward wasn't a ghost. He was real. He loved systems, routines, documentation. Somewhere in that neat little world he kept so tightly managed, there had to be a breadcrumb. I started with property records, county databases, real estate transfers, zoning permits. I looked in every city we'd ever visited, every beach town he'd ever mentioned in passing. I searched for deeds under his name, under my name, under aliases we used to joke about when we played games at the airport. Nothing, not a single hit, like he'd never owned anything, like he didn't exist. I searched social media. Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, everything stale. His profiles were scrubbed, not deactivated, scrubbed, like they'd never been there. No mutual friends posted anything. No pictures tagged him. I even tried searching old comments he'd left years ago on articles and forums. Gone. Buried or deleted. His digital fingerprint had been wiped clean. Then I tried something I hadn't touched since he left. Our old joint accounts. Bank logins. Investment dashboards. Passwords we'd memorized but never wrote down. The logins still worked, but they were empty. Split down the middle, executed with surgical precision. No notices, no overdrafts, no alerts. All automated, all cold. One transaction caught my eye, a wire transfer, mid-5 figures, to a regional bank I didn't recognize, somewhere on the coast, a place I'd never been, a town so small it barely registered on GPS unless you zoomed in manually. I called the number listed for the bank, stomach in knots. A woman with a clipped accent answered. "I'm trying to confirm a wire transfer," I said, masking my desperation. She took the information, silent stretching. "There's no customer by that name," she said finally. "And that account was closed last week." "Closed?" "Yes, ma'am." "Is there a forwarding address, contact number?" "I'm sorry, that account is sealed." Sealed. I didn't even know banks used that word. I drove there, 7 hours, I didn't pack, just printed the address, grabbed my coat, and left. I don't remember the drive, just the way the road narrowed the closer I got to the water, the way the air smelled different, older, like brine and pine and distance. The town was barely a town, a gas station, a bait shop, a small diner with peeling paint and a sun-bleached closed Mondays sign. I found the bank, or what used to be one. The windows were papered over. A faded notice taped to the door read, "Branch permanently closed." I crossed the street to the post office. "I'm looking for a man," I told the clerk, showing him a photo of Edward. He had a P.O. box registered here. The man squinted at the image, then nodded. "Yeah, box 111. My breath caught. "Can I?" "It was shut last week. Mail forwarded to private courier. No forwarding address on file." "Did he leave a name?" The man shrugged, said he didn't want to be found. The weight of those words landed like a stone in my chest. Not can't be found. Didn't want to. Every door I pushed creaked open just far enough to show me I was late, that he'd already come and gone, already closed every account, every box, every trace, not like a man running from something, but like one walking into a new life with a map I was never meant to see. I stood in the parking lot for a long time after, not crying, not moving, just watching the trees shift in the wind and realizing that every version of him I remembered had been folded away with more care than I ever gave him. He hadn't just left me. He'd deleted the life we shared, and I was the only one still trying to remember it. He was exactly where I expected him to be, down by the marina where the smell of diesel and salt water seemed baked into the planks. The gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp against the morning air, and Edward's old fishing buddy Mark was bent over the fuel pump, coaxing it like an old friend. His boat was rocking gently, a faded red strip down the side, the same one Edward used to brag about fixing better than the manufacturer ever did. For a moment I almost turned around. My breath wasn't steady, my pulse too loud in my ears, but I walked toward him anyway, each step feeling like I was dragging a weight tied to my ankles. He didn't look surprised to see me when I reached him, just straightened slowly, wiped his hands on a rag, and waited. He always had that patience about him, the kind that made silence feel heavier than words. "I just want to understand," I said, my voice cracked, embarrassing me instantly. I hadn't meant to sound so small. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the small cooler at his feet, pulled out a paper cup, and handed it to me. Coffee, hot, bitter, comforting in the old unspoken way that men like him communicated things they didn't want to say out loud. I held the cup but didn't drink it. My fingers were shaking too much. Mark leaned one elbow on the railing, watched the water slap against the hull. "He told me what you said at dinner." There it was, the sentence I had heard in my head every night, as loud as a slammed door. I lowered my eyes, staring at the coffee like it might shield me. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded," I whispered. "That's the thing about words," he said quietly. "They don't change shape just because you regret them." The wind picked up, rolling through the masts like a sigh. Mark kept his gaze on the water, almost as if looking at me would make the truth land too hard. He said, "Sometimes closure is an act of mercy." The world seemed to tilt. I gripped the railing to keep myself from swaying. "He gave you what you wanted." I closed my eyes because keeping them open felt impossible. The back of my throat burned. I tried to swallow, but the air felt stuck. A single gust carried the faintest scent of engine oil and ocean brine. Edward's scent on every fishing trip, every weekend he spent down here with Mark, while I insisted I had better things to do. "He's not angry." My voice was barely there. "Not even a little?" Mark finally looked at me, and the kindness in his eyes hurt worse than anger could have. He was hurt, deep, but anger fades. Decisions don't. The cup in my hands felt too hot, too heavy, like it might collapse under the pressure of everything I hadn't said before it was too late. I opened my mouth to ask where Edward was, to beg for something, an address, a number, a clue, but the look on Mark's face stopped me cold. He wasn't hiding Edward from me. Edward had already hidden himself, and he'd done it so thoroughly with such quiet determination that even the people who loved him had decided to honor it. I felt the truth settle in my chest, cold and brutal. He didn't leave to hurt me. He left because I told him, with my own careless cruelty that losing him would heal me. And he believed me enough to vanish. The apartment didn't change, but it felt smaller every day. The walls seemed to pull inward, drawing tight around me like fabric shrinking in the wash. Every sound amplified, the hum of the refrigerator, the shuffle of mail through the slot, the faint creak of the hallway pipes. But the loudest thing was the absence. Silence where his footsteps used to be. Silence where his steady breaths used to smooth out the nights. Silence where we used to argue, laugh, exist. My friends stopped checking in as often. At first, they called, texted, left voicemails. But I was always somewhere else, inside my head, inside old memories, inside a guilt loop that wouldn't unwind. I canceled plans, showed up late, drifted through conversations like someone who didn't know the language anymore. Eventually, the invitation slowed, then they stopped. They didn't say it, but I knew. I wasn't the person they remembered. I wasn't even a person, really. Just someone moving through the motions, brittle and distracted, trapped inside a grief I couldn't justify to anyone because I'd built it myself. Work wasn't better. My boss pulled me into her office twice in 1 month, tapping her pen against late reports and half-finished projects. I nodded through her concerns, promising improvement, but when I sat at my desk afterward, the words on the screen blurred into nothing. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unable to connect thoughts long enough to type. I forgot meetings, missed deadlines. I watched my reputation erode the same way everything else had, quietly, steadily, with no one to blame but myself. I forgot birthdays. Not just acquaintances, people I loved, my sister, my godson, a friend who once held my hand through a medical scare. Their messages sat unread, blinking like small warning lights I pretended not to see. I let them pile up, unanswered. I told myself I'd get to them eventually. Eventually never came. The drawer beside my bed became a graveyard of things I didn't want to look at. Old photos, a watch he once left on the nightstand and never wore again, receipts from dinners that felt like another lifetime. And there, under a stack of greeting cards I never mailed, was the divorce decree we'd been sent months before, our marriage dissolved in every way but paper. He hadn't signed a section, neither had I. It felt absurd to stare at it, this document that once represented an ending I thought would free us both. Now it looked like a relic from another universe, a universe where he still answered my calls, where I still had the option of leaving instead of being left. I ran my thumb along the edge of the paperwork. The silence in the apartment deepened like the walls were waiting. Eventually, with a knot in my throat, I folded the decree neatly into an envelope. I didn't sign it. I couldn't. Instead, I pressed a small sticky note to the front. Just 2 words. Too late? It looked pathetic, desperate, but it was honest. For the first time in months, it felt honest. I mailed it the same afternoon, dropping it into the blue box outside the post office with shaking hands. Something inside me hoped he'd see it, open it, recognize the message beneath the question. But a week later, on a gray Tuesday morning, the envelope slid back through my mail slot, not forwarded, not redirected, unopened. I stood there holding it, fingers cold around the edges, staring at his name written in my handwriting, a name that no longer belonged to me, a name tied to someone who had removed himself so thoroughly from our history that even a legal document couldn't find him. He hadn't rejected it. He'd made himself unreachable. I pressed the envelope against my chest, sliding down to the floor as the quiet settled around me again. Heavy, absolute. It wasn't that I'd waited too long to reach for him, it was that he'd already reached somewhere I could never follow. The knock came just after 5. The sun hadn't fully set, but the light was thin and retreating, leaking through the windows in long shadows that made everything in the apartment feel taller and older. I wasn't expecting anyone. I barely expected myself anymore. The air had that brittle quality that comes with late autumn, the kind of chill that clings to your skin and whispers reminders of all the things you didn't say in time. I opened the door slowly, half hoping it was a delivery mistake, maybe a neighbor needing something, anyone else, but not her. She stood with her hands folded neatly in front of her, a woman in her early 40s, composed, grounded, the kind of quiet power you don't notice until you've already underestimated it. She had a jacket zipped to her collarbone and wine-kissed cheeks that made her seem like she'd just stepped out of a world that wasn't mine. "Sophie?" she asked. Her voice was calm. clear but not uncertain. I nodded, too surprised to speak. "I'm not here to fight," she said gently. "I'm just here to give you peace." Peace. The word echoed in my chest like a thud. I blinked, stepping back slightly. "Do I know you?" She offered a soft, knowing smile. "Not really, but you know him." Everything inside me stilled. I didn't ask who she meant. I didn't need to. The way she said it, him, not Edward, like he'd become something entirely separate from the man I used to love, something whole. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. Without a word, she placed it gently into my hand. Edward, he looked older, softer. His eyes had that brightness I hadn't seen in years, not since before things began to unravel. He was seated on a weathered dock, hair windswept, holding a baby swaddled in a deep blue blanket. His arms weren't just protective, they were proud, like he'd been waiting his entire life for that moment. A family built from peace instead of pain. I stared at the image, breath trapped somewhere between disbelief and something far more painful. Grief's sharper cousin, the one that knows you're the reason for your own absence. I turned the photo over with trembling fingers. On the back, in the unmistakable rhythm of his handwriting, were the words, "We all get one chance to disappear." He took his. The silence between us stretched. She didn't rush it. She let me process. Let the truth hit exactly where it needed to land. "You said he was your biggest mistake," she said, softer now, but no less certain. "He believed you, and he gave you exactly what you asked for." I looked up at her, tears brimming now but held back by pride, and pain tangled too tightly to separate. "He was," I whispered. "He was my mistake." She tilted her head slightly, then nodded, not to agree, but to understand, to acknowledge the weight of what I said. "He was a mistake," she replied. "Just not for me." The words didn't sting. They didn't need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to, on the wreckage I'd spent months trying to salvage, finally telling me the salvage was never mine to begin with. I didn't ask where they lived. I didn't ask how they met, or when. I didn't want to know how far I'd pushed him, how long he'd planned his exit, or how she had managed to gather all the pieces I'd scattered and make something beautiful from them. Some stories don't need epilogues. She nodded once more, then turned to leave, her footsteps fading down the hall. The door closed gently behind her. In my hand, the photograph trembled slightly. I didn't cry. I just stood there, alone in the quiet he once filled, realizing that the man I drove away had found a life I could never touch again, and that his last gift to me wasn't punishment. It was mercy, closure in the form of goodbye that would never need to be spoken.